Who were the most disastrous military commanders of World War II? While history celebrates brilliant tacticians and strategic masterminds, it also remembers those whose decisions led to catastrophic defeats, needless casualties, and turning points that changed the course of nations. In this video, we reveal the stories of 5 generals whose leadership failures stand as cautionary tales of military incompetence, poor judgment, and the devastating consequences of flawed command. These are not merely commanders who lost battles, but military leaders whose decisions were so profoundly misguided that they altered the fate of their armies and their countries. From the catastrophic fall of France to the humiliating surrender of Singapore, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, these generals share a common legacy of failure that continues to fascinate military historians today. The ranking of the worst generals is a complex undertaking, as incompetence can manifest in many forms. Some generals failed due to rigid adherence to outdated tactics. Others displayed a stunning lack of strategic vision or an inability to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Some were plagued by personal character flaws such as cowardice, arrogance, or an inability to inspire their troops. Still others simply found themselves in positions far beyond their capabilities, promoted due to political connections rather than military merit. What unites the 5 commanders we will examine today is the scale and significance of their failures. These were not minor setbacks or unavoidable defeats against overwhelming odds. These were disasters that could have been prevented, catastrophes born from poor leadership, faulty judgment, and fundamental misunderstandings of modern warfare. Let us begin with a man whose name has become synonymous with the catastrophic collapse of French military power in the spring of 1940. Maurice Gustave Gamelin was born on September 20, 1872, in Paris, France. His military career began in an era when cavalry charges and colonial campaigns defined warfare. He graduated from the prestigious École Spéciale Militaire de Saint-Cyr in 1893 and quickly established himself as a competent staff officer. During World War I, Gamelin served with distinction on the staff of General Joseph Joffre, participating in the crucial Battle of the Marne in 1914 that halted the German advance on Paris. His administrative skills and careful planning earned him praise and steady promotion through the ranks. By the interwar period, Gamelin had become one of France's most respected military figures, serving in various high-ranking positions, including commander of French forces in Syria, and later as Chief of Staff of the French Army. In 1935, Maurice Gamelin reached the pinnacle of his career when he was appointed as the Supreme Commander of the French Armed Forces. He was also given the title of Vice President of the Supreme War Council. At 63 years old, he stood as the guardian of French military power, responsible for defending the nation that still bore the scars of the previous World War. France in the 1930s was a nation haunted by the memory of the trenches, where an entire generation had been decimated between 1914 and 1918. The country had invested enormous resources in the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the German border that represented the epitome of defensive thinking. The strategy was simple in concept. Make the border so impregnable that Germany would never dare attack, or if they did, they would be ground down in a war of attrition that France could win. Gamelin embodied this defensive mindset completely. He was a man of the previous war, shaped by its lessons and unable or unwilling to grasp the revolutionary changes that were transforming military science. While German theorists like Heinz Guderian were developing the concept of blitzkrieg, combining tanks, aircraft and motorized infantry in fast-moving coordinated attacks, Gamelin remained fixated on static defense and methodical, set-piece battles. He saw tanks as infantry support weapons to be distributed along the front, not as independent strike forces capable of deep penetration. He underestimated the importance of air power and failed to coordinate effectively with the British Royal Air Force. Most critically, he dismissed intelligence reports suggesting that Germany might attack through the Ardennes forest, considering the terrain too difficult for large-scale armor operations. This assumption would prove to be his most fatal error. When Germany launched its invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, France and Britain declared war but took little offensive action. This period, known as the Phony War or Drôle de Guerre, lasted from September 1939 until May 1940. During these crucial months, Gamelin had time to prepare for the inevitable German assault on France. He had approximately 3 million French troops, along with British and Belgian forces, to defend against the expected attack. The French army was well equipped, with thousands of tanks that were in many cases superior to German models. France also had a substantial air force and the support of the world's most powerful navy through its alliance with Britain. On paper, the Allies had significant advantages. However, Gamelin squandered this opportunity through a combination of poor strategic planning, inadequate coordination with allies, and a fundamental misunderstanding of modern mobile warfare. Gamelin's plan for defending France, known as the Dial Plan, called for Allied forces to advance into Belgium when Germany attacked, meeting the Germans along the Dial River. This plan assumed that Germany would repeat its World War I strategy of sweeping through Belgium and attacking France from the north. However, Gamelin placed his best and most mobile forces in this northern sector, leaving the Ardennes region to his south defended by weaker second-line troops. He had convinced himself that the Ardennes forest was impassable to large mechanized forces, despite warnings from junior officers who had studied the terrain carefully. When one subordinate suggested that the Ardennes was vulnerable, Gamelin reportedly dismissed the concern, stating that if the Germans did attack through the Ardennes, they would be caught in a trap. This casual dismissal of a legitimate strategic concern demonstrated a dangerous overconfidence and a failure to seriously evaluate alternative scenarios. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. As Gamelin had anticipated, German forces attacked through Belgium and the Netherlands, and he immediately ordered his best units forward to implement the Dial Plan. The French 7th Army and the British Expeditionary Force advanced into Belgium exactly as Gamelin had prepared them to do. However, this was precisely what the Germans wanted. Unknown to Gamelin, the main German attack was not in Belgium at all. While he was focusing on the expected assault in the north, the strongest concentration of German armour, 7 panzer divisions organised into 3 corps under generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, was pushing through the Ardennes forest. The terrain that Gamelin had declared impassable became the highway for German victory. The German panzer divisions emerged from the Ardennes on May 13, 1940, at Sedan, a location with bitter memories for France as the site of their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The defenders in this sector were poorly trained reserve divisions, inadequately equipped and completely unprepared for the ferocity of the German assault. German dive bombers attacked French positions while tanks and infantry crossed the Meuse River. Within hours, German forces had established bridgeheads on the west bank of the Meuse. Within days, they had torn a massive gap in the French lines. The best French and British units were now trapped in Belgium, having advanced forward exactly as Gamelin had planned, while German armour was racing behind them toward the English Channel, threatening to cut them off completely. Gamelin's response to this crisis demonstrated the full extent of his inadequacy as a commander. He seemed paralysed by the speed and violence of the German breakthrough. His headquarters at Vincennes, a medieval fortress outside Paris, lacked even basic modern communications equipment. He had no radio communications with his field commanders and relied on motorcycle couriers and telephone lines that were often cut by German advance units. While German commanders like Guderian were leading from the front, making rapid decisions and exploiting every opportunity, Gamelin was isolated in his fortress, receiving information that was hours or even days out of date. He issued contradictory orders, commanded attacks by units that no longer existed or had already been destroyed, and seemed unable to grasp the catastrophic reality unfolding before him. His staff officers watched in horror as the Supreme Commander appeared to lose his grip on the situation entirely. On May 19, 1940, just 9 days after the German attack began, Gamelin was relieved of command. He was replaced by Maxime Weygand, a general who was even older at 73 years of age, but who at least recognized the severity of the crisis. However, by this point, the damage was irreversible. The German breakthrough at Sedan had created a situation that no amount of tactical skill could repair. The best Allied armies were trapped in a pocket in Belgium and northern France, with German forces between them and Paris. The British Expeditionary Force would have to evacuate from Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th, leaving behind almost all of its heavy equipment. France would surrender on June 22, 1940, just 6 weeks after the German invasion began. The speed and completeness of the French defeat shocked the world. A nation that had been considered one of the world's great military powers, a country that had fought Germany to a standstill for 4 years in World War I, had collapsed in less than 2 months. Gamelin's failure was not simply a matter of bad luck or being defeated by a superior enemy. The German and Allied forces were relatively evenly matched in numbers and equipment. What Germany possessed was better doctrine, better leadership, and better use of modern military technology. Gamelin's strategic plan played directly into German hands, concentrating Allied strength in the wrong location and leaving the critical sector at Sedan vulnerable. His inability to adapt when the German strategy became apparent, his failure to maintain adequate communications with his field commanders, and his apparent mental collapse under the pressure of rapidly developing events all contributed to a disaster that could have been mitigated by better leadership. The fall of France changed the course of World War II. It left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, shifted the strategic balance of power in Europe, and emboldened Hitler to pursue even more ambitious goals. While many factors contributed to France's defeat, Maurice Gamelin's incompetent leadership stands as one of the primary causes. Following the defeat, Gamelin was arrested by the French government and charged with failing in his duties. He was held at various locations, eventually being imprisoned by the collaborationist Vichy government. In 1942, the infamous Rheims trial began, where the Vichy regime attempted to place blame for France's defeat on the Third Republic's leadership. Gamelin was one of the principal defendants. However, the trial backfired on the Vichy government. Gamelin and other defendants used the proceedings to point out that they had been undermined by politicians who refused to adequately fund military preparations, and they highlighted the collaboration of Vichy leaders with Germany. The trial was suspended and never concluded. Gamelin was subsequently deported to Germany, where he was held in Castle in Austria, along with other prominent French prisoners. He was liberated by American forces in May 1945. After the war, Gamelin lived in relative obscurity until his death on April 18, 1958, at the age of 85. He wrote his memoirs attempting to justify his actions and place blame elsewhere for the disaster of 1940. However, history has not been kind to Maurice Gamelin. His name is inextricably linked with one of the most stunning military defeats in modern history. He represents the dangers of promoting officers based on seniority and past achievements, rather than their ability to adapt to new forms of warfare. He embodies the catastrophic consequences of fighting the next war with the tactics and mindset of the previous one. Gamelin's failure was not just a French tragedy, but a cautionary tale for military establishments everywhere about the importance of innovation, adaptability, and the willingness to challenge established assumptions. While Gamelin's failure was dramatic and had enormous strategic consequences, our next commander's incompetence manifested in a different but equally destructive way. His story takes us from the fields of France to the deserts of North Africa, where Italian military ambitions collided disastrously with reality. Rodolfo Graziani was born on August 11, 1882, in Filatino, Italy, a small town in the mountains southeast of Rome. He joined the Italian army as a young man and saw his first combat experience during Italy's colonial wars in North Africa. He participated in the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911, fighting against Ottoman forces and later against Libyan resistance fighters. These early campaigns in Africa would define his career, though not in the heroic manner he might have hoped. Graziani gained a reputation for brutality and ruthlessness in his colonial campaigns, earning the nickname the Butcher of Fezzan for his harsh suppression of resistance in Libya during the 1920s and 1930s. During Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 to 1936, Graziani served as commander of forces on the southern front. His conduct during this campaign was marked by numerous atrocities, including the use of chemical weapons against Ethiopian forces and civilians, aerial bombardment of Red Cross facilities, and reprisal massacres against civilian populations. An assassination attempt on Graziani in Addis Ababa in February 1937 led to a 3-day massacre of Ethiopian civilians and intellectuals, with thousands killed in brutal reprisals ordered by Graziani. Despite, or perhaps because of, this brutal record, Graziani was promoted to Marshal of Italy in 1936, one of the highest ranks in the Italian military. He was appointed as the Governor-General of Italian East Africa, ruling Ethiopia with an iron fist. However, his military skills were far less impressive than his willingness to employ terror tactics against poorly armed colonial populations. When World War II began in September 1939, Italy initially remained neutral. Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, was not prepared for a major war despite his bombastic rhetoric about restoring the glory of the Roman Empire. However, watching Germany's stunning victories in Poland and France, Mussolini decided he could not miss the opportunity to share in the spoils of what appeared to be an imminent Axis victory. On June 10, 1940, just as France was collapsing under the German onslaught, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Mussolini appointed Graziani as the Governor-General of Libya and Commander-in-Chief of Italian North African forces. His mission was to invade Egypt, capture the Suez Canal, and expand Italy's African empire, while Britain was reeling from the fall of France. On paper, Graziani had overwhelming advantages. His forces in Libya numbered approximately 250,000 men organized in 10 divisions, along with hundreds of tanks and aircraft. Facing him across the Egyptian border was the British Western Desert Force, numbering only about 36,000 men with limited armor and air support. Despite this massive numerical superiority, Graziani was reluctant to attack. He sent numerous messages to Mussolini complaining about supply shortages, the quality of Italian equipment, the harsh desert conditions, and the strength of British defences. These were not entirely unfounded concerns. Italian tanks were indeed inferior to British models, being thinly armoured and prone to mechanical failures. Italian supply lines stretched back across the Mediterranean to Italy, making them vulnerable to British naval and air attacks. The desert itself was a hostile environment that required specialised training and equipment. However, Graziani's complaints also revealed a fundamental lack of aggressive spirit and an unwillingness to take risks. While Mussolini pressed him to attack immediately and take advantage of Britain's weakness, Graziani delayed and procrastinated. Finally, on September 13, 1940, more than 3 months after Italy entered the war, Graziani reluctantly ordered his forces to invade Egypt. The advance was painfully slow and cautious. Italian forces moved approximately 60 miles into Egypt over the course of several days, advancing at a pace that even Mussolini found frustratingly timid. They stopped at the small coastal town of Sidi Barrani, where Graziani ordered his forces to dig in and establish fortified camps. Rather than pushing forward to exploit his numerical advantage, Graziani adopted a defensive posture, building static fortifications in the desert. His camps were spread out over a wide area with gaps of 15 to 20 miles between them, supposedly to avoid concentrated British artillery fire, but actually creating a situation where each camp was isolated and could be defeated in detail. The Italian advance stopped completely at Sidi Barrani. For the next 3 months, Graziani's army sat in its desert camps while British forces prepared a counterattack. Despite having a massive numerical advantage, and despite Mussolini's increasingly angry demands for action, Graziani refused to advance further. He claimed he needed more supplies, better equipment, and more time to prepare. In reality, he seems to have lost his nerve completely. The Desert War was far different from suppressing poorly armed colonial resistance fighters in Ethiopia. Here, he faced a professional, well-trained British force commanded by officers who understood mobile warfare. The psychological pressure proved too much for him. On December 9, 1940, British forces under General Archibald Wavell launched Operation Compass, a limited offensive intended initially as a large-scale raid to disrupt the Italian camps. What happened next was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. British forces, numbering only 36,000 men with about 275 tanks, smashed into the Italian positions at Sidi Barrani. The isolated Italian camps, unable to support each other, were overrun one by one. Italian soldiers surrendered in massive numbers, often offering little resistance. The morale of Graziani's army collapsed almost immediately. What was supposed to be a 5-day raid turned into a complete rout of Italian forces. British forces pursued the retreating Italians westward across Libya. Despite outnumbering the British by a significant margin, Italian forces were unable to mount any effective defence. Graziani's command structure fell apart as his officers abandoned their positions and fled westward. By early February 1941, British forces had advanced over 500 miles, captured the key Libyan ports of Tobruk and Benghazi, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and captured approximately 130,000 Italian prisoners. British casualties in this campaign were astonishingly light, with fewer than 2,000 men killed or wounded. The disaster was so complete and so humiliating that it became a propaganda windfall for the British and a source of deep embarrassment for Italy. The myth of Italian military prowess, carefully cultivated by fascist propaganda, was shattered in the desert of North Africa. Graziani's response to this catastrophe was predictable. He blamed everyone but himself. He claimed his soldiers were cowards, his equipment was inadequate, his supplies were insufficient, and his superiors had forced him into an impossible situation. On February 10, 1941, he resigned his command and returned to Italy in disgrace. He was replaced by General Italo Garibaldi, but by this point the damage was irreversible. Hitler, furious at Italian incompetence and worried that a British victory in North Africa would threaten Axis interests in the Mediterranean, sent German forces under Erwin Rommel to prop up the collapsing Italian position. Thus, arrival of the Afrika Korps in February 1941 would transform the North African campaign, but it could not erase the stain on Graziani's reputation. However, Graziani's story of failure and moral bankruptcy did not end with his resignation in North Africa. After Mussolini was overthrown in July 1943 and Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943, northern Italy was occupied by German forces. Mussolini was rescued by German commandos and installed as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet state in northern Italy. Graziani, despite his previous failures, was appointed as the Minister of Defense of this collaborationist regime. In this capacity, he organized military units that fought alongside the Germans against Italian partisans and Allied forces. He was responsible for brutal reprisals against partisan activity and civilian populations suspected of supporting the resistance. Once again, Graziani showed that while he was a poor battlefield commander, he was quite willing to employ terror tactics against defenseless populations. When the war in Italy ended in April 1945, Graziani surrendered to Allied forces. He was tried by an Italian military tribunal for collaboration with the Germans and for war crimes committed during his service to the Italian Social Republic. In 1950, he was sentenced to 19 years in prison, though his sentence was reduced and he was released after serving only 4 months. The leniency of his sentence and his quick release caused considerable controversy, particularly among those who remembered his brutal conduct in Ethiopia and his collaboration with the Nazis. Graziani spent his remaining years writing self-serving memoirs that attempted to rehabilitate his reputation. He died on January 11, 1955, at the age of 72, largely forgotten except as a symbol of military incompetence and moral failure. Graziani's legacy is one of missed opportunities and catastrophic defeat. Given overwhelming numerical and material advantages, he managed to turn a campaign that should have been a straightforward victory into one of the most humiliating routes in modern military history. His timidity, lack of aggressive spirit, and failure to properly organize and motivate his forces transformed Italy's North African adventure from Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire into a disaster that required German intervention to prevent complete collapse. His willingness to employ brutal tactics against defenseless populations contrasted sharply with his incompetence when facing trained military opposition. While Maurice Gamelin's failure came from rigid thinking and an inability to adapt to modern warfare, Graziani's failure stemmed from a fundamental lack of the qualities required for high command in a major war: courage, decisiveness, and the ability to inspire and lead troops in difficult circumstances. From the deserts of North Africa, we turn our attention to the Pacific, theatre, and to a general whose name will forever be associated with one of the most devastating and humiliating defeats in British military history. Arthur Percival was born on December 26, 1887, in Aspenden, Hertfordshire, England. Unlike many career military officers of his generation, Percival did not come from an aristocratic military family. His father was a land agent, a respectable middle-class profession, but far from the traditional officer class. Percival initially pursued a business career working as a clerk in London. However, with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, he volunteered for military service and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Bedfordshire Regiment. His service during the Great War was distinguished. He fought at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where he was wounded. He demonstrated bravery under fire and competent leadership of small units, earning promotion to captain and later to temporary major. By the war's end, he had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross, decorations that recognized genuine courage and effective combat leadership. After World War I, Percival chose to remain in the army as a career officer. During the interwar years, he served in various postings, including several years in Malaya, where he participated in operations against communist insurgents. He also attended Staff College and gained a reputation as a meticulous staff officer with excellent administrative skills. He was intelligent, hard-working, and thoroughly professional in his approach to military service. However, these qualities, while valuable, did not necessarily translate into the decisiveness and boldness required of a commanding general in a major war. Percival advanced steadily through the ranks, reaching the rank of Major General by 1939. His career progression seemed to indicate that he was destined for high command, though some of his contemporaries noted that he lacked the forceful personality and aggressive spirit typically associated with successful combat commanders. In May 1941, Arthur Percival was appointed as General Officer commanding Malaya. This position placed him in command of all British, Indian and Australian forces in Malaya and Singapore, one of the most strategically important positions in the British Empire. Singapore was considered the Gibraltar of the East, a supposedly impregnable fortress that protected British interests in Southeast Asia, secured vital trade routes, and served as the main base for the Royal Navy in the Pacific. The conventional wisdom held that Singapore could withstand any attack, particularly from the land side, as the thick jungles of the Malayan Peninsula were thought to be impassable to large military forces. British defences were oriented primarily toward the sea, with massive coastal guns designed to repel a naval assault. This focus on defending against a seaborne attack would prove to be a catastrophic misjudgment. Percival arrived in Singapore to find a defence establishment that was complacent and ill-prepared for modern warfare. The garrison consisted of approximately 85,000 troops, a seemingly large force, but many were poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and unfamiliar with jungle warfare. The majority were Indian Army units, along with British, Australian, and Malayan forces. Air power was limited, with obsolete aircraft that were no match for Japanese fighters and bombers. There were no modern tanks, as British planners had convinced themselves that armour was useless in jungle terrain. Most critically, the entire defensive strategy was based on the assumption that Japan would attack from the sea and that the Royal Navy could arrive in time to repel any invasion. This assumption ignored both the deteriorating international situation and the reality of Japan's military capabilities. Percival recognized many of these problems and requested reinforcements, better equipment, and permission to build defensive fortifications on the northern approaches to Singapore. However, his requests were largely denied or ignored by authorities in London who did not believe Japan would dare attack British possessions. Even when Percival pressed the issue, pointing out the inadequacy of Singapore's defences against a land assault, he was told that such preparations would damage civilian morale and give the appearance of defeatism. The civilian government in Singapore was particularly opposed to any measures that might disrupt normal economic activity or suggest that the British position was vulnerable. Percival, ever the dutiful staff officer, did not push back as forcefully as the situation demanded. This was one of his key failings: an excessive deference to political authority and an unwillingness to insist on military necessity, even when it conflicted with civilian preferences. On December 8, 1941, hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita invaded Malaya from Thailand. The invasion force numbered approximately 70,000 troops, actually fewer than the Allied garrison, but these were battle-hardened veterans experienced in jungle warfare, equipped with light tanks and supported by complete air superiority. The Japanese had studied the terrain carefully, developed tactics specifically for jungle fighting, and moved with a speed and aggression that caught British forces completely off guard. Percival's defensive plan quickly fell apart. Japanese forces advanced down the Malayan Peninsula with startling rapidity, consistently outmaneuvering and outfighting British defenders. What was supposed to be a campaign lasting months was over in weeks. The Japanese demonstrated repeatedly that they were masters of jungle warfare, using infiltration tactics, flanking movements, and aggressive pursuit to keep British forces constantly off balance. British troops, trained for European-style warfare and demoralized by the speed of the Japanese advance, often retreated before they had even made contact with the enemy. The myth of European military superiority over Asian forces was shattered in the jungles of Malaya. Percival issued orders for defensive stands at various points along the peninsula, but each position was outflanked or penetrated with seemingly effortless ease by Japanese forces. His command structure was breaking down, his communications were disrupted, and his forces were becoming increasingly disorganized and demoralized. One of the most significant disasters of the Malayan campaign was the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse on December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the invasion began. These capital ships, rushed to Singapore to provide naval support, were caught by Japanese aircraft without adequate air cover and sunk with heavy loss of life. The destruction of Force Z, as the naval squadron was known, eliminated any hope of naval relief and left Singapore completely vulnerable to Japanese air and sea power. This catastrophe was not Percival's fault directly, but it removed one of the key assumptions underlying British defensive planning and exposed how completely unprepared Britain was for war with Japan. By the end of January 1942, Japanese forces had driven British defenders the entire length of the Malayan Peninsula. What remained of Percival's army, now numbering perhaps 70,000 to 85,000 men, depending on sources, retreated across the causeway linking Malaya to the island of Singapore. On January 31, 1942, the causeway was partially destroyed to slow the Japanese advance, and Singapore itself came under siege. The situation was grim, but not necessarily hopeless. Singapore had stockpiles of supplies, strong defensive positions, and still had a substantial garrison. However, morale was shattered, leadership was confused, and the will to resist had been eroded by weeks of continuous retreat. Percival faced a critical decision. Should he attempt a last-ditch defense of Singapore, or should he evacuate as many troops as possible to fight another day? Percival chose to defend Singapore, though his defense was marked by the same indecisiveness and poor coordination that had characterized the Malayan campaign. Japanese forces landed on the northwest corner of Singapore Island on February 8, 1942, quickly establishing beachheads despite some fierce resistance from Australian units. The defenders outnumbered the Japanese attackers, but this numerical advantage meant nothing in the face of superior Japanese tactics, training, and leadership. Percival's forces were poorly positioned, with reserves held too far back to conduct effective counterattacks. Communication between units broke down almost immediately. Some units fought with desperate courage, but others surrendered quickly or simply melted away. The Japanese advance, though meeting resistance, was relentless. A critical factor in the fall of Singapore was the water supply. The city's reservoirs were located in the central part of the island, and as Japanese forces advanced, these water sources came under their control. By February 13, 1942, water supplies to the city were severely compromised. Percival was informed that the city had perhaps only days of water remaining for the massive civilian population and military garrison. The spectre of hundreds of thousands of people dying of thirst in a besieged city created enormous pressure on Percival to surrender. However, the water crisis was partially a result of Percival's own failings. He had not adequately prepared for the defense of the island's infrastructure, had not ensured proper distribution of water supplies, and had not organized a coherent defensive plan that prioritized protecting these vital resources. On February 15, 1942, just 1 week after the Japanese landings on Singapore Island and only 70 days after the invasion of Malaya began, Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore to General Yamashita. The meeting took place at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah, where Percival, exhausted and defeated, signed the instrument of surrender. Approximately 80,000 British, Indian and Australian troops became prisoners of war, the largest surrender in British military history. The fall of Singapore was not just a military defeat, but a psychological catastrophe that shattered the prestige of the British Empire throughout Asia. The supposedly impregnable fortress had fallen in just over 2 months to a numerically inferior Japanese force that had advanced over 650 miles through terrain that British planners had considered impassable. the debate over Percival's responsibility for this disaster has continued for decades. Some argue that he was placed in an impossible situation, inheriting inadequate defences, facing a skilled and determined enemy, and receiving insufficient support from London. There is truth to these arguments. Britain in 1941 was fighting for survival in Europe and North Africa, and Singapore was inevitably a lower priority. The forces sent to defend Malaya were often second-rate units with obsolete equipment. However, these mitigating factors do not absolve Percival of his share of responsibility. He failed to recognize the magnitude of the Japanese threat before the invasion began. He did not prepare adequate defensive positions on the northern approaches to Singapore, despite having months to do so. His conduct during the campaign showed a consistent pattern of poor decision-making, failure to coordinate his forces effectively, and an inability to inspire confidence in his subordinates. Most damning was Percival's decision to surrender when he still had tens of thousands of troops, substantial ammunition supplies, and defensible positions. While the water situation was serious, it was not yet catastrophic. Some historians argue that a more determined commander could have continued the defense for weeks or even months, tying down Japanese forces that were needed elsewhere in the Pacific. Others contend that such a prolonged defense would have resulted in massive civilian casualties without changing the ultimate outcome. What is clear is that Percival's reputation as a commander, fairly or unfairly, was destroyed by the fall of Singapore. In the eyes of many, he had surrendered too easily, giving up when continued resistance was still possible. Percival spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of the Japanese. His treatment, like that of all Allied prisoners in Japanese custody, was harsh. He was held in Manchuria for most of his captivity, suffering from malnutrition and disease. However, he survived the war and was present in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, as an observer during the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. After his liberation, Percival returned to Britain, where he found himself a controversial figure. Some blamed him personally for the Singapore disaster, while others defended him as a scapegoat for systemic British failures in the Far East. He wrote a memoir attempting to explain his actions and defend his decisions, but he never fully escaped the shadow of Singapore. He died on January 31, 1966, at the age of 78. History remembers Arthur Percival as the general who surrendered Singapore, presiding over one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. While Percival's failure unfolded in the jungles of Southeast Asia, another general was about to experience a devastating baptism of fire in the deserts of North Africa. His name was Lloyd Fredendall, and his story illustrates how rapidly a military reputation can be destroyed when a commander is exposed to the crucible of combat. Lloyd Ralston Fredendall was born on December 28, 1883, in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1905, entering the Army during a period of American military expansion. His early career was spent in various garrison and training assignments, typical for a peacetime officer. During World War I, unlike many of his contemporaries who gained combat experience in France, Fredendall remained in the United States as a training officer. This lack of combat experience in the Great War would prove significant, as he reached senior command in World War II without ever having led troops in battle. During the interwar period, Fredendall advanced steadily through the ranks, gaining a reputation as an efficient administrator and training officer. He was known for his aggressive personality and his confidence in his own abilities, traits that impressed some superiors but also made him unpopular with many of his subordinates. He had a particular talent for impressing visiting dignitaries and senior officers during training exercises, giving the appearance of competence and dynamism. However, this peacetime success in training commands did not necessarily translate to effectiveness in actual combat. By 1942, as the United States mobilized for war after Pearl Harbor, there was an urgent need for corps and division commanders. Fredendall, now a major general, seemed like a logical choice based on his rank, his experience in training, and his forceful personality. In August 1942, Fredendall was given command of the Central Task Force for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. This was a massive undertaking, as American forces had not conducted a major amphibious operation since World War I. The invasion, launched on November 8, 1942, targeted 3 locations: Morocco and Algeria. Fredendall's Central Task Force landed at Oran, Algeria. The landings were successful, though not without difficulties, and French forces in Algeria, after brief resistance, agreed to a ceasefire. Fredendall received credit for this success, though the operation had been planned in detail by staff officers, and the French resistance had been relatively limited. Nevertheless, his reputation was enhanced, and he was promoted to command of the WW2 Corps, which would be the main American combat force in Tunisia. The Tunisian campaign would be Fredendall's first experience commanding troops in sustained combat against determined opposition. Allied strategy in North Africa called for a rapid advance eastward through Algeria and Tunisia, trapping Axis forces between British forces advancing from the east and American forces coming from the west. However, the campaign did not proceed as smoothly as planned. German and Italian forces evacuating from Libya after their defeats by the British 8th Army established strong defensive positions in the mountainous terrain of Tunisia. The Germans, under the command of General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, and later reinforced by elements of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, prepared to defend Tunisia with characteristic efficiency. Fredendall's performance as Corps commander immediately revealed serious flaws in his leadership. He established his headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines in a deep ravine, where he ordered engineers to excavate elaborate shelters and tunnels into the rock. While his official justification was that this location provided good communications with his subordinate divisions, the real reason seemed to be an excessive concern for his own safety. He spent enormous engineering resources on these personal bunkers, resources that could have been used to improve defensive positions at the front. His subordinate division commanders found it difficult to get in contact with him, and he rarely visited frontline units to assess the situation personally. This physical and psychological distance from the battlefield would prove catastrophic. Equally problematic was Fredendall's treatment of his subordinates. He had particular contempt for the 1st Armoured Division commander, Major General Orlando Ward, and the commander of Combat Command A, Brigadier General Raymond McQuillan. Rather than working through the established chain of command, Fredendall bypassed Ward and issued orders directly to subordinate units, creating confusion and undermining Ward's authority. His communications were often sarcastic and demeaning, damaging morale among officers who were already struggling with the challenges of fighting in unfamiliar terrain against experienced German troops. He showed little understanding of armoured warfare, frequently dividing his tank forces into small packets and scattering them across the front, rather than concentrating them for decisive action. The situation came to a head in mid-February 1943 at the Kasserine Pass, a critical gap in the mountains of western Tunisia. Fredendall had deployed his forces in a dispersed manner across a wide front, with inadequate defensive positions and poor mutual support between units. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces were concentrating for an attack, but Fredendall failed to properly prepare his defences or ensure that his units were in strong, mutually supporting positions. On February 14, 1943, German forces under Rommel's command launched Operation Frühling's Wind, a major offensive aimed at destroying Allied forces in western Tunisia. The attack fell primarily on inexperienced American units that had never faced German armour before. The result was a disaster. German forces punched through American defensive positions with ease, routing entire battalions and capturing hundreds of prisoners along with tanks, artillery pieces, and other equipment. American troops, many of them seeing combat for the first time, broke and fled in confusion. Some units fought bravely and conducted organised withdrawals, but others simply disintegrated under the ferocity of the German assault. By February 20th, 1943, German forces had advanced through Kasserine Pass and were threatening to break into the Allied rear areas. The defeat was not just a tactical setback, but a profound shock to American confidence. These were supposed to be modern, well-equipped American forces with superior industrial backing, yet they had been routed by numerically inferior German units. Fredendall's response to the crisis was telling. Rather than moving forward to personally assess the situation and rally his troops, he remained in his elaborate headquarters far behind the lines, issuing contradictory orders and blaming his subordinates for the disaster. He particularly blamed Major General Orlando Ward and the 1st Armoured Division, despite the fact that Ward's forces had been poorly positioned and inadequately supported due to Fredendall's own orders. The situation was only stabilized when German forces, having achieved their immediate objectives and facing stiffening resistance, chose to withdraw back through Kasserine Pass. This withdrawal was driven more by Rommel's assessment that further advance was unsustainable than by anything Fredendall had done to stop the German offensive. The Kasserine Pass disaster cost the US 2 Corps approximately 6,000 casualties, including 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. Large quantities of equipment were lost, including over 200 tanks and tank destroyers. More damaging than the material losses was the blow to American prestige and confidence. This was the first major engagement between American and German ground forces in World War II, and it had resulted in a humiliating defeat. The American military and American public were shocked by the outcome. Questions were immediately raised about the quality of American training, equipment, and most importantly, leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in North Africa, had visited the Second Corps headquarters shortly before the German offensive and had come away with serious concerns about Fredendall's leadership. After Kasserine, these concerns turned into certainty that Fredendall had to be relieved. However, the situation was delicate. Relieving a corps commander so publicly after a major defeat could further damage already shaken American morale. Additionally, Fredendall had powerful supporters in Washington, including Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, who had considered him one of his most promising commanders. Nevertheless, the evidence of Fredendall's incompetence was overwhelming. His subordinates had lost confidence in him. British allies were openly questioning American military competence, and the facts of his poor deployment, inadequate supervision, and failure to properly lead during the crisis were undeniable. On March 6, 1943, just 2 weeks after the Kasserine disaster, Fredendall was relieved of command of the Second Corps. He was replaced by Major General George S. Patton, an aggressive and charismatic leader who would transform the Corps' morale and combat effectiveness. Fredendall's relief was handled quietly to minimize public embarrassment. He was promoted to Lieutenant General, a political maneuver designed to soften the blow and avoid the appearance of disgrace, and was given a training command in the United States for the remainder of the war. This promotion, despite his catastrophic failure in combat, caused considerable resentment among officers who understood what had really happened at Kasserine Pass. However, it reflected the political realities of the American military system and the desire to protect the reputation of a general who had been strongly supported by senior leadership. Fredendall never commanded troops in combat again. He spent the rest of the war in training commands, positions where his organizational skills could be utilized without risking soldiers' lives in battle. After the war, he retired with full honors and lived quietly until his death on October 4, 1963, at the age of 79. Unlike some generals whose failures were debated by historians, Fredendall's incompetence at Kasserine Pass was so evident and so well documented that there has been little controversy about his place among World War II's worst commanders. His case illustrates the dangers of promoting officers based on peacetime performance and personal connections rather than demonstrated ability to lead troops under fire. It also demonstrates how quickly a military reputation can collapse when exposed to the harsh realities of combat. The lessons of Kasserine Pass, painful as they were, proved valuable for the American military. The defeat forced a hard-headed reassessment of tactics, training, and leadership. Incompetent commanders like Fredendall were weeded out, while talented leaders like Patton, Bradley, and others were given opportunities to prove themselves. American forces learned from their mistakes, improved their combined arms coordination, and developed the confidence and competence that would characterize their performance for the remainder of the war. In a sense, Fredendall's failure, catastrophic as it was for those who served under him, contributed to the eventual success of American arms by exposing weaknesses that could then be corrected. However, this does nothing to diminish the human cost of his incompetence or his responsibility for the unnecessary deaths and suffering of American soldiers. From the deserts of Tunisia, we turn our attention to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, where our final general's incompetence would lead to one of the most catastrophic military disasters in history. His name was Dmitri Grigorievich Pavlov, and his story is unique among our 5 commanders because it ended not in quiet retirement or comfortable captivity, but in execution by his own government. Dmitri Pavlov was born on October 23, 1897, in the village of Vonishevo in the Kostroma region of Russia. He came from peasant origins, a typical background for many who would rise to prominence in the Soviet military after the Bolshevik Revolution. Pavlov joined the Red Army in 1919 during the Russian Civil War, fighting against White Russian and foreign intervention forces. His peasant origins and Communist Party loyalty made him a favored candidate for advancement in the new Soviet state, which was purging officers from the old Imperial Army and building a new military establishment based on ideological reliability as much as professional competence. During the 1920s and 1930s, Pavlov advanced through the ranks, specializing in armored warfare. He attended military academies and became an advocate for mechanized forces in the Red Army. In 1936, he was sent to Spain as a military advisor during the Spanish Civil War, where he commanded Soviet tank units supporting the Republican forces against Franco's nationalists. His experience in Spain would have profound and ultimately disastrous effects on his thinking about armored warfare. In Spain, he observed that tanks operating without adequate infantry support were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. Republican tank attacks often failed when isolated tank units advanced beyond their supporting infantry and were picked off by nationalist anti-tank guns. From this experience, Pavlov concluded that the era of large-scale independent tank operations was over, and that tanks should be dispersed among infantry units rather than concentrated in independent mechanized corps. This conclusion was exactly wrong. The problem in Spain was not that independent tank operations were obsolete, but that the Republicans lacked the training, doctrine, and coordination necessary to execute combined arms operations effectively. German and Soviet military theorists observing the same conflict reached the opposite conclusion, that the future of warfare lay in concentrated mechanized forces capable of rapid breakthrough and exploitation, supported by air power and motorized infantry. The Germans would prove this concept in Poland and France with devastating effectiveness. However, Pavlov's misinterpretation of the Spanish Civil War would influence Soviet military doctrine at a critical moment. Upon returning to the Soviet Union, he advocated strongly for disbanding the Red Army's large mechanized corps and distributing tanks in small units among rifle divisions. Tragically, Pavlov's views found support among Soviet leadership, particularly from Joseph Stalin and his political cronies who controlled military policy. In November 1939, the Soviet Union reorganized its armored forces, disbanding the mechanized corps that had been created in the mid-1930s. This decision, influenced heavily by Pavlov's recommendations, was a catastrophic error that would leave the Soviet Union unprepared for the German invasion in 1941. The tanks that should have been concentrated in powerful striking forces capable of launching counterattacks against German penetrations were instead scattered across the front in small, vulnerable packets. The irony is terrible. Pavlov was advocating for a doctrine that the Germans had already proven obsolete in their conquest of Poland and France, yet Soviet leadership accepted his arguments because of his combat experience in Spain and his political reliability. In June 1940, Dmitri Pavlov was promoted to General of the Army and appointed commander of the Western Special Military District, which would become the Western Front when Germany invaded. This district covered the approaches to Minsk and Moscow, making it one of the most strategically critical commands in the Soviet Union. Pavlov now commanded approximately 625,000 troops, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and hundreds of aircraft. On paper, his forces were formidable. However, they suffered from numerous weaknesses that Pavlov either failed to recognize or was powerless to correct. Many units were understrength and poorly trained. Equipment was often obsolete, with large numbers of outdated tanks and aircraft. The reorganization of mechanized forces had created chaos in the command structure. Most critically, Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s had decimated experienced leadership at all levels, creating a military establishment terrified to show initiative or question orders from above. Pavlov himself embodied many of these problems. While he had combat experience, his conclusions from that experience were flawed. He was politically reliable, but not intellectually flexible. He was loyal to Stalin, but had seen what happened to generals who fell out of favor. They were arrested, tortured, and executed. This environment of terror and conformity was not conducive to the kind of frank assessment and honest reporting that competent military leadership requires. When intelligence reports in early 1941 indicated a massive German military buildup along the Soviet border, Pavlov and other district commanders were caught between the evidence of an impending attack and Stalin's insistence that Germany would not invade. To report honestly on the threat meant risking Stalin's wrath and potential execution. To prepare defensive measures without authorization might be seen as provocation or defeatism. Trapped in this impossible situation, Pavlov did neither adequately. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., Operation Barbarossa began. Over 3 million German and Axis troops, organized into 3 massive army groups, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The German invasion was one of the largest military operations in history, employing nearly 4,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft, and 600,000 motor vehicles in a coordinated assault designed to destroy the Red Army in a series of massive encirclement battles. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, struck directly at Pavlov's Western Front. The German plan called for 2 panzer groups to penetrate Soviet defenses north and south of Minsk, and then link up behind the city, trapping Pavlov's entire front in a massive pocket. The initial German assault was devastating. Soviet border posts were overrun, communications were severed, and confusion reigned throughout the Western Front. Many Soviet units were caught completely by surprise despite the obvious signs of impending attack. Soviet aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields near the border were destroyed on the ground by German airstrikes. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority, allowing German ground forces to advance with minimal interference from Soviet air power. Pavlov's dispersed tank brigades, rather than being concentrated for powerful counterattacks, were fed piecemeal into the battle and destroyed in detail by German forces that had overwhelming local superiority at each point of contact. The command structure of the Western Front began to fall apart almost immediately as German advances cut communications between headquarters and frontline units. Pavlov's response to the crisis showed both the paralysis induced by fear of Stalin and his own inadequacy as a commander. Rather than attempting to organize a coherent defense or conduct an organized withdrawal to more defensible positions, he issued orders for frontal counterattacks by forces that no longer existed or could not reach their objectives. He reported to Moscow that the situation was under control when it manifestly was not, perhaps hoping that the truth would somehow change, or that admitting the scale of the disaster would result in his immediate arrest. Stalin, receiving these false reports, continued to believe that the situation could be salvaged by aggressive counterattacks, an illusion that Pavlov's dishonest reporting helped maintain. When the truth became unavoidable, Stalin's rage was directed not primarily at the German enemy, but at the Soviet commanders who he believed had betrayed him through incompetence and cowardice. By June 28, 1941, just 6 days after the invasion began, German forces had surrounded Minsk, trapping much of Pavlov's Western Front in a massive encirclement. Approximately 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in this pocket, along with thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and other equipment. It was one of the largest encirclement battles in military history, a catastrophe of staggering proportions. The road to Moscow lay open, defended only by scattered remnants of destroyed formations and hastily mobilized reserve units. The entire defensive plan for the Western Soviet Union had collapsed, and the responsibility fell squarely on Dmitri Pavlov. Whether through poor doctrine, inadequate preparation, dishonest reporting, or simple incompetence, he had presided over a disaster that threatened the survival of the Soviet state. Stalin's response was characteristically brutal. On June 28th, Pavlov was relieved of command and recalled to Moscow. He was arrested on July 4, 1941, and accused of cowardice, criminal negligence, and treasonous activity. Along with Pavlov, several of his subordinate commanders and staff officers were also arrested, including the Western Front's Chief of Staff, Major General Vladimir Klimovsky, the commander of the Fourth Army, Major General Alexander Korobkov, and others. They were subjected to interrogation and torture by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. The charges were largely fabricated or vastly exaggerated. While Pavlov was certainly incompetent and had made serious errors, accusations of deliberate treason were groundless. However, in Stalin's system, failure was indistinguishable from betrayal, and someone had to be held accountable for the catastrophe. On July 22, 1941, exactly 1 month after the German invasion began, Dmitri Pavlov, Vladimir Klimovsky, Alexander Korobkov, and several other officers were tried by the military collegium of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union. The trial was swift and its outcome predetermined. All were found guilty of cowardice, lack of resolve, criminal neglect of duty, surrendering weapons to the enemy without a fight, and abandoning combat. Positions without orders from higher command. The sentences were death by firing squad. On the same day the verdicts were announced, July 22, 1941, Pavlov and his co-defendants were executed. They were shot in the courtyard of the prison, their bodies disposed of in unmarked graves. The executions were publicized to serve as a warning to other commanders. Failure would not be tolerated, and defeat was equivalent to treason in Stalin's Soviet Union. The execution of Pavlov and his subordinates was both a travesty of justice and a symptom of the Soviet system's fundamental flaws. While Pavlov was unquestionably incompetent and bore significant responsibility for the Western Front's collapse, he was also a victim of a military and political system that he had helped create. The doctrine he had advocated, based on his experience in Spain, had contributed to the disbanding of mechanized corps. The purges of the late 1930s, which he had survived while more competent officers were executed, had gutted the Red Army's leadership. The climate of terror that made honest reporting to Stalin impossible had prevented adequate preparation for the German attack. Pavlov's incompetence was real, but it was nurtured and enabled by a system that valued political loyalty over professional competence, that punished initiative and honesty, and that made scapegoating inevitable when disasters occurred. In 1956, during the de-Stalinization campaign under Nikita Khrushchev, Pavlov and the other executed officers were posthumously rehabilitated. The charges of treason were officially recognized as false, and their military ranks were restored. This rehabilitation acknowledged that while they may have been incompetent, they were not traitors, and their executions had been unjust. However, this posthumous exoneration could not restore their lives or change the fact that their execution had served Stalin's political purposes in 1941. Pavlov's legacy remains controversial in Russia. Some view him as a scapegoat for systemic failures beyond any individual's control. Others see him as a genuinely incompetent commander whose flawed ideas contributed to Soviet unpreparedness. What is undeniable is that the catastrophe on the Western Front in June 1941 was one of the worst military disasters of World War II, and Dmitri Pavlov, as the front commander, bears a significant share of responsibility for it. The contrast between Pavlov's fate and that of the other commanders we have examined is striking. Maurice Gamelin lived to write his memoirs and died peacefully in retirement. Rodolfo Graziani received a minimal prison sentence and lived comfortably until his natural death. Arthur Percival survived Japanese captivity and returned home to England. Lloyd Fredendall was promoted and given a comfortable stateside command for the remainder of the war. Only Dmitri Pavlov paid with his life for his failures, executed not by the enemy but by his own government. This brutal accountability reflected both the extremes of the Soviet system and the magnitude of the disaster Pavlov had helped precipitate. The Western Front's collapse in 1941 threatened the survival of the Soviet Union itself, making it, in Stalin's eyes, an unforgivable crime regardless of mitigating circumstances. Having examined 4 generals whose failures ranged from catastrophic defeats to inexcusable incompetence, we now turn to our 5th and final commander, a figure whose place on this list may surprise some viewers. Unlike the others, this general achieved significant victories and is remembered by some as a hero. However, his catastrophic errors, strategic blindness, and the unnecessary suffering he caused to troops under his command earn him a place among World War II's worst generals. His name was Douglas MacArthur, and his story illustrates how even a commander with undeniable talents can fail disastrously when arrogance, poor judgment, and refusal to acknowledge reality combine with the awesome responsibilities of high command. Douglas MacArthur was born on January 26, 1880, on an army base in Little Rock, Arkansas. He came from a distinguished military family. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a decorated Civil War hero who later became a lieutenant general and military governor of the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur seemed destined for military greatness from birth. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he compiled one of the most impressive academic records in the institution's history, graduating first in his class in 1903. His early career included service in the Philippines, Japan, and various assignments that brought him into contact with the highest levels of American government and society. He served with distinction in World War I, commanding the 42nd Rainbow Division in France and earning numerous decorations for bravery. After World War I, MacArthur's rise continued. He became superintendent of West Point from 1919 to 1922, where he modernized the curriculum and relaxed some of the Academy's more rigid traditions. In 1930, he was appointed Army Chief of Staff, the highest position in the US Army, serving in this role until 1935. However, his tenure as Chief of Staff was controversial. During the Great Depression, he oversaw the violent dispersal of the Bonus Army, a group of World War I veterans who had marched on Washington demanding early payment of promised bonuses. The use of military force against American veterans protesting for economic relief damaged MacArthur's reputation and showed a side of his personality that would resurface repeatedly, an inability to empathize with subordinates or question his own judgment. In 1935, MacArthur accepted an appointment as military advisor to the Commonwealth Government of the Philippines, which was preparing for full independence from the United States. He was tasked with organizing a defense force for the Philippines and training its army. He approached this task with characteristic confidence, believing that he could create a military force capable of defending the islands against any aggressor. However, the reality was far more complex than MacArthur acknowledged. The Philippines consisted of thousands of islands with limited infrastructure, a poor population, and minimal industrial capacity. Creating an effective military force under these conditions would have been challenging, even with unlimited resources and time. MacArthur, however, consistently overestimated his progress and understated the difficulties. He reported to Washington that the Philippine Army would be capable of effective defense, a claim that events would prove to be wildly optimistic. When war between the United States and Japan appeared increasingly likely in 1941, MacArthur was recalled to active duty as a Major General and appointed as Commander of United States Army Forces in the Far East, or US FFE. This command included American forces in the Philippines, the Philippine Army, and the newly constituted Philippine Scouts. MacArthur now commanded approximately 130,000 troops, a substantial force on paper, but one with severe weaknesses. The Philippine Army units were poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and had little combat experience. Many had been called up just months before war began and had received minimal preparation. American forces, while better trained, were not the cream of the US military. Equipment was often outdated and reinforcements were limited due to the priority given to the European theatre. MacArthur's plan for defending the Philippines was ambitious to the point of delusion. Previous American strategy, embodied in War Plan Orange 3, called for a fighting withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula if Japan invaded, where American and Filipino forces could hold out until the US Navy could fight its way across the Pacific to relieve them. This plan was realistic, given the forces available and the strategic situation. However, MacArthur rejected this strategy, insisting that he could defend the entire Philippine archipelago and repel any Japanese invasion at the beaches. He believed that the combination of American air power based around the newly arrived B-17 bombers at Clark Field and his ground forces could defeat any Japanese attack. This assessment ignored numerous obvious realities: Japanese air and naval superiority in the region, the inadequate training of Filipino troops, the vulnerability of dispersed beach defenses, and the simple fact that the Philippines could not be reinforced or resupplied if war began. MacArthur's confidence infected his staff and led to a series of catastrophic miscalculations. When warned about the vulnerability of American aircraft concentrated at Clark Field, he dismissed the concerns, apparently believing that Japanese pilots could not execute the kind of coordinated attack that would threaten his air bases. This was an astounding failure of intelligence and judgment. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, should have immediately alerted MacArthur to the devastating effectiveness of Japanese air power and the need to disperse and protect American aircraft. However, hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, American B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters at Clark Field remained parked closely together, poorly dispersed and inadequately protected. When Japanese bombers struck Clark Field on December 8, 1941, approximately 9 hours after Pearl Harbor, and with MacArthur having received explicit warning of the attack on Hawaii, they found American aircraft lined up as if for inspection. Half of the American bomber force in the Philippines was destroyed on the ground, along with numerous fighters. American air power, which MacArthur had counted on as a decisive factor in Philippine defense, was crippled before it could even engage the enemy effectively. The destruction of American air power at Clark Field was a disaster entirely preventable with proper leadership. MacArthur had hours of warning, yet his aircraft were caught on the ground in perfect formations for enemy attack. Historians have debated exactly what MacArthur was doing during the critical hours between the Pearl Harbor attack and the strike on Clark Field. Some suggest he was paralyzed by shock, others that he was engaged in confused conferences with subordinates, still others that he refused to believe war had actually begun. Whatever the explanation, the result was clear. His forces were caught unprepared, and American air superiority, which might have made Japanese invasion much more costly, was lost in a single morning. This failure alone would mark MacArthur as a poor commander, but it was just the beginning of a series of disastrous decisions. Japanese invasion forces landed in the Philippines beginning on December 10, 1941, with the main landings occurring at Lingayen Gulf on December 22, 1941. MacArthur's beach defense strategy collapsed immediately. Filipino units facing veteran Japanese troops with air and naval support broke and fled. The elaborate defense plans proved worthless in the face of determined Japanese assaults. MacArthur's headquarters, located in Manila, became increasingly isolated as Japanese forces advanced rapidly inland. On December 24, 1941, MacArthur finally admitted defeat and ordered a withdrawal to Bataan Peninsula, implementing the very War Plan Orange 3 strategy he had so confidently rejected months earlier. However, because he had not prepared for this eventuality, the withdrawal was chaotic and poorly coordinated. Large stocks of supplies that should have been moved to Bataan were left behind or destroyed. Troops that should have been positioned to defend the peninsula were scattered across Luzon. The defense of Bataan, which might have lasted many months with proper preparation, was compromised from the start by MacArthur's previous overconfidence. MacArthur established his headquarters on the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay, while his troops retreated to Bataan Peninsula. For the next 3 months, American and Filipino forces on Bataan fought a desperate defensive battle against overwhelming Japanese forces. Supplies were critically short because MacArthur had not prepared adequate stockpiles for a prolonged defense. Food rations were cut repeatedly, leaving troops malnourished and susceptible to disease. Medical supplies were insufficient, and tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery decimated the defenders. Despite these impossible conditions, American and Filipino troops fought with remarkable courage and determination, holding out far longer than Japanese commanders had expected. However, their commander was not with them. MacArthur remained on Corregidor, issuing communiques that bore little relationship to reality, claiming victories that had not occurred and minimizing the desperate situation his troops faced. MacArthur's public relations during the Philippine campaign were masterful but deeply dishonest. His communique presented him as leading heroic resistance against overwhelming odds, personally directing battles and inspiring his troops. The American public, desperate for any good news from the Pacific, where disaster was following disaster, embraced MacArthur as a hero. Newspapers ran stories about Dugout Doug, leading his men in battle, though in reality he remained safely on Corregidor and rarely visited the front lines on Bataan. His troops, starving and dying from disease and Japanese attacks, grew increasingly bitter about their commander's self-promotion while they suffered. The contrast between the heroic image MacArthur cultivated and the reality of his absence from the worst fighting would create lasting resentment among Bataan veterans. In February 1942, as the situation in the Philippines became increasingly hopeless, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. Roosevelt needed a symbol of American resolve in the Pacific, and MacArthur, despite his failures, had become that symbol through his skillful public relations. On March 11, 1942, MacArthur, his family, and selected members of his staff left Corregidor on PT boats, escaping to Mindanao and then flying to Australia. He left behind approximately 76,000 American and Filipino troops on Bataan and Corregidor to face certain capture. Upon arriving in Australia, MacArthur made his famous statement, "I came through and I shall return," which was later shortened to the more dramatic, "I shall return." This promise would become one of the most famous quotes of World War II, cementing MacArthur's image as a heroic leader. However, to the men he left behind on Bataan, who would endure brutal captivity and the infamous Bataan Death March, MacArthur's departure seemed less like a strategic necessity and more like abandonment. The fall of Bataan came on April 9, 1942, when Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 76,000 American and Filipino troops, the largest surrender in American military history. Corregidor held out until May 6, 1942, when Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, MacArthur's successor, surrendered the fortress and all remaining American forces in the Philippines. The prisoners faced horrific treatment by their Japanese captors. The Bataan Death March, a forced march of prisoners from Bataan to prison camps, resulted in the deaths of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers from exhaustion, dehydration, disease, and Japanese brutality. Those who survived faced years of harsh captivity with inadequate food, medical care, and shelter. The suffering of these men stands as a direct consequence of MacArthur's failures: his overconfident defensive plan, his failure to protect American air power, his inadequate preparation for the defense of Bataan, and his absence during their final desperate struggle. MacArthur's advocates argue that he was placed in an impossible situation, defending an indefensible position with inadequate forces against overwhelming Japanese superiority. There is truth to this argument. The Philippines, located thousands of miles from American supply bases and surrounded by Japanese-controlled territory, could not realistically have been held in 1941 and 1942. However, this strategic reality makes MacArthur's decisions even more inexcusable. If the Philippines could not be successfully defended, then his responsibility was to minimize casualties, preserve as much of his force as possible, and prepare for the inevitable siege according to established plans. Instead, he promised victory, rejected proven defensive strategies, failed to protect critical assets like his air force, and created a disaster that was worse than it needed to be. A competent, realistic commander might have evacuated American forces before they were trapped, or at least prepared. Proper defenses for Bataan that could have prolonged the siege for many additional months. MacArthur did neither. What makes MacArthur's inclusion on this list of worst generals controversial is that, unlike the other four commanders, he went on to achieve significant success later in the war. After his evacuation to Australia, he commanded Southwest Pacific Area forces in the Island Hopping Campaign that eventually led to the reconquest of the Philippines in 1944 and 1945. He accepted the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. After the war, he oversaw the occupation and reconstruction of Japan with considerable skill. During the Korean War, he led the daring Incheon landing that reversed early North Korean victories. His later successes have led many historians to overlook or minimize his failures in the Philippines. However, success in one campaign does not erase disaster in another. MacArthur's failures in defending the Philippines were catastrophic, preventable, and resulted in enormous suffering for the men under his command. Furthermore, even in his later successes, MacArthur displayed the same character flaws that had contributed to his failures in the Philippines. His arrogance, his dismissal of intelligence that contradicted his preconceptions, and his belief in his own infallibility continued to create problems. In Korea, his overconfidence and refusal to consider the possibility of Chinese intervention led to a massive Chinese counteroffensive that nearly destroyed United Nations forces and turned a potential victory into a prolonged stalemate. His public disagreements with President Truman over strategy ultimately led to his relief from command in 1951, ending his military career in controversy rather than triumph. These later failures suggest that MacArthur's incompetence in the Philippines was not an anomaly, but a reflection of persistent character flaws that occasionally overcame his undeniable military talents. MacArthur died on April 5, 1964, at the age of 84, still revered by many as one of America's greatest generals. His funeral was a state occasion, with full military honors and tributes from presidents and world leaders. His legacy remains contested. To his admirers, he was a brilliant strategist, a fearless leader, and a symbol of American military power. To his critics, he was an egotistical, insubordinate commander whose arrogance and poor judgment caused unnecessary defeats and suffering. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere between these extremes. MacArthur was capable of both brilliance and catastrophic error, both inspiring leadership and callous disregard for his troops' welfare. However, in assessing his performance in the Philippines in 1941 and 1942, the verdict must be harsh. He failed to prepare adequate defenses, failed to protect critical assets, failed to implement sound defensive plans, and failed to honestly assess either his own capabilities or the enemy's strengths. These failures resulted in one of the worst American military defeats of World War II. What unites our 5 generals, despite their different nationalities, different theatres of operation, and different ultimate fates, is a set of common failings that transcended their individual circumstances. Maurice Gamelin was a prisoner of outdated thinking, unable to adapt to the revolutionary changes in warfare that the Germans had mastered. Rodolfo Graziani lacked the courage and competence to employ his overwhelming advantages effectively, turning potential victory into humiliating defeat. Arthur Percival inherited a difficult situation, but made it catastrophically worse through indecisiveness, poor preparation, and premature surrender. Lloyd Fredendall demonstrated that peacetime success and political connections are no substitute for genuine military competence when bullets start flying. Dmitri Pavlov showed how flawed doctrine, political terror, and personal inadequacy can combine to create disaster on an almost incomprehensible scale. And Douglas MacArthur proved that even a general with undeniable talents can fail disastrously when arrogance and self-delusion override professional judgment. These failures offer lessons that remain relevant for military organizations today. First, promotion should be based on demonstrated competence under realistic conditions, not on political connections, seniority, or peacetime performance alone. Lloyd Fredendall excelled at training and impressing visiting dignitaries, but collapsed when faced with actual combat. Rodolfo Graziani was effective at suppressing poorly armed colonial subjects, but proved helpless against professional military opposition. Second, military organizations must encourage adaptability and innovation rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. Maurice Gamelin's inability to question the Maginot Line mentality contributed directly to France's defeat. Dmitri Pavlov's misinterpretation of the Spanish Civil War led to the disbanding of mechanized corps just when they were most needed. Third, commanders must be honest in their assessments, both with their superiors and with themselves. Douglas MacArthur's false promises about Philippine defense and Arthur Percival's reluctance to admit the inadequacy of Singapore's defenses contributed to catastrophic unpreparedness when war came. Fourth, the quality of leadership matters enormously, particularly in crisis. When the German breakthrough occurred at Sedan, France needed a commander who could adapt quickly, inspire confidence, and make bold decisions. Instead, they had Maurice Gamelin, isolated in his medieval fortress, unable even to communicate effectively with his field commanders. When American forces were routed at Catherine Pass, they needed a leader who could rally them and restore their morale. Instead, they had Lloyd Fredendall, cowering in his elaborate bunker 70 miles, behind the lines. Fifth, even talented commanders can fail if their egos and ambitions override their judgment. Douglas MacArthur possessed genuine military gifts, but his arrogance and refusal to acknowledge reality turned the Philippine defense into a worse disaster than it needed to be. Finally, political systems that punish honesty and reward conformity create conditions where military incompetence flourishes. Dmitri Pavlov operated in a system where telling Stalin the truth could result in execution, making honest assessment of Soviet military readiness nearly impossible. The human cost of military incompetence is staggering and often falls most heavily on those with the least responsibility for the failures. The French soldiers who died at Sedan, the Italian troops who surrendered in the desert, the defenders of Singapore who endured years of brutal captivity, the American forces who fought and died at Catherine Pass, the Soviet soldiers trapped at Minsk, and the American and Filipino defenders of Bataan who faced death marches and prison camps all paid the price for their commanders' failures. These men fought with courage and determination, often achieving remarkable results despite catastrophic leadership. Their sacrifice and suffering magnify the guilt of the generals whose incompetence put them in impossible situations. Military history celebrates victorious generals, and rightly so, but it must also remember the failures, if only to honour those who suffered because of them, and to provide lessons that might prevent similar disasters in the future. The question of how to evaluate military commanders is complex and contested. Some argue that judging historical figures by modern standards is unfair, that we must consider the context of their times, the limitations they faced, and the information available to them. This argument has merit. Maurice Gamelin operated in a military culture shaped by the trauma of World War I, where entire generations had been destroyed in trench warfare. His defensive mindset, while disastrous in 1940, was a rational response to the horrors of the previous war. Arthur Percival inherited defensive plans and force dispositions that had been established long before he took command. The decision to orient Singapore's defences toward the sea reflected strategic assumptions made at the highest levels of British government, not just one general's misjudgment. Dmitri Pavlov operated under Stalin's terror, where honest reporting could result in execution. His failures must be understood in the context of a system designed to produce exactly this kind of incompetence. However, while context matters, it cannot excuse fundamental failures of leadership and judgment. Gamelin had years to prepare for German attack and access to intelligence indicating the Wehrmacht's new tactics. He chose to ignore or dismiss this information. Graziani commanded forces that outnumbered his opponents by vast margins, and still managed to turn the campaign into a humiliating rout through his timidity and poor leadership. Percival had the authority to insist on proper defensive preparations for Singapore, and chose deference to civilian authorities over military necessity. Fredendall's cowardice, his abusive treatment of subordinates, and his failure to properly position his forces cannot be blamed on circumstances beyond his control. MacArthur's arrogant rejection of proven defensive plans and his failure to protect his air forces were conscious choices, not unavoidable errors. In each case, different decisions by the commander could have significantly improved outcomes, even if they could not have guaranteed victory. Furthermore, the comparison with contemporaries shows that these failures were not inevitable products of their times. While Gamelin was clinging to outdated doctrine, other French officers like Charles de Gaulle were advocating for modern armoured warfare, while Graziani was failing miserably. In North Africa, German commanders like Erwin Rommel were demonstrating how effective leadership could achieve remarkable results with limited forces. While Percival was preparing inadequate defences for Singapore, other British commanders in Burma and India were developing effective jungle warfare tactics. While Fredendall was cowering in his bunker, other American commanders like George Patton and Omar Bradley were leading from the front and learning from early mistakes. While Pavlov was disbanding mechanized corps based on flawed interpretations of the Spanish Civil War, other Soviet officers were recognizing the value of concentrated armor. And while MacArthur was rejecting sound defensive plans, other American commanders facing desperate situations were executing fighting withdrawals and defensive battles with skill and determination. The existence of more competent contemporaries suggests that these commanders' failures reflected individual inadequacy, not just the constraints of their situations. The legacy of these 5 generals extends far beyond their own failures. The fall of France under Gamelin's leadership changed the entire course of World War II, leaving Britain isolated and enabling Hitler to turn his full attention to the Soviet Union. It demonstrated to the world that France, one of the great powers of Europe, could be defeated in weeks, fundamentally altering perceptions of military power and European security. The disaster would cast a long shadow over French society and politics for generations. Graziani's failures in North Africa necessitated German intervention, transforming what might have remained a peripheral theatre into a major campaign that would tie down substantial Axis resources for years. His brutal conduct in Ethiopia and his collaboration with the Nazi puppet regime in northern Italy left a legacy of war crimes that continues to provoke controversy in Italy and Ethiopia today. Percival's surrender of Singapore shattered the myth of European colonial invincibility in Asia. Throughout Southeast Asia, colonized peoples watched as Japanese forces defeated British, Dutch, and American forces with seeming ease, while Japan's own brutality would eventually turn much of Asian opinion against them. The initial defeats of colonial powers planted seeds of independence movements that would emerge after the war. The fall of Singapore accelerated the end of European colonialism in Asia, a process that would fundamentally reshape the post-war world. For Britain specifically, the loss of Singapore represented a humiliation from which the empire never fully recovered, marking a critical step in Britain's decline from global superpower to regional power. Fredendall's disaster at Kasserine Pass, while smaller in scale than the other defeats we have examined, had important consequences for American military development. The shock of defeat forced the US Army to ruthlessly identify and remove incompetent commanders, improve training, and develop better combined arms coordination. The lessons learned at Kasserine, painful as they were, contributed to the steady improvement in American combat effectiveness that characterized the remainder of the war. However, the cost in American lives and the blow to national confidence made Kasserine a watershed moment in America's World War II experience. Pavlov's catastrophe on the Soviet Western Front in June 1941 nearly led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Had Moscow fallen in 1941, as seemed possible in the immediate aftermath of Pavlov's defeat, the entire war would have taken a radically different course. The disaster also contributed to Stalin's paranoid purges of military officers, creating a climate of fear that would inhibit Soviet military effectiveness throughout the war. MacArthur's failures in the Philippines resulted in the largest surrender in American military history and years of suffering for prisoners of war. The Bataan Death March became one of the most infamous atrocities of World War II in the American consciousness, fueling hatred of Japan and determination to achieve total victory. The reconquest of the Philippines became a major American strategic objective, driven partly by MacArthur's personal promise to return and partly by the need to redeem the humiliation of 1941 and 1942. This focus on the Philippines arguably delayed the end of the Pacific War by directing resources to MacArthur's theatre that might have been better used elsewhere. The controversy surrounding MacArthur's conduct also raised important questions about civil-military relations, the role of public relations in modern warfare, and the accountability of senior commanders that remain relevant today. These 5 generals represent different types of military failure, each offering unique lessons about the nature of incompetent command. Maurice Gamelin represents the danger of promoting officers based on seniority and past performance, rather than their ability to adapt to new challenges. He was an excellent staff officer in World War I, methodical and careful in his planning. These same qualities, which had served him well in the previous war, became fatal liabilities when facing an enemy that had revolutionized warfare. His story teaches us that yesterday's successful officer may become tomorrow's failure if he cannot evolve with changing circumstances. Military organizations must constantly challenge their assumptions, reward innovation, and be willing to bypass seniority when promoting commanders to critical positions. The French army in 1940 had talented younger officers who understood modern warfare, but they were subordinated to aging generals like Gamelin, who had learned the wrong lessons from the previous war. Rodolfo Graziani embodies a different type of failure, the commander who is effective at suppressing the weak but helpless when facing competent opposition. His brutal effectiveness in colonial warfare, where he commanded overwhelming force against poorly armed resistance movements, gave him a reputation for ruthlessness and success. However, these colonial campaigns bore little relationship to modern warfare between professional armies. When facing British forces that, despite being outnumbered, were professionally trained and effectively led, Graziani's limitations were exposed immediately. His timidity, his constant complaints about supply shortages, despite having massive material superiority, and his inability to inspire or lead his troops revealed him as fundamentally unsuited for high command in a major war. His story warns against confusing brutality toward the defenseless with genuine military competence. Arthur Percival represents the tragedy of the well-meaning but indecisive commander placed in an impossible situation. Unlike some of our other subjects, Percival was not obviously incompetent or morally compromised. He was intelligent, hardworking and concerned for his troops' welfare. However, he lacked the force of personality and decisive judgment necessary for command in a crisis. His excessive deference to civilian authorities when military necessity demanded action, his failure to prepare adequate defences despite having months to do so, and his premature surrender when continued resistance was still possible, all stemmed from a fundamental weakness of character. His story teaches that competence and good intentions are not sufficient for high command. Commanders must be able to make hard decisions, insist on unpopular measures when military necessity demands them, and steel themselves to continue fighting even when the situation appears hopeless. Niceness and conscientiousness are admirable qualities, but they must be combined with moral courage and decisiveness to be effective in war. Lloyd Fredendall illustrates the danger of promoting officers based on their ability to impress superiors in peacetime rather than their demonstrated competence under fire. He excelled at training exercises, looked good during inspections, and had a forceful personality that impressed senior officers. However, these peacetime talents masked serious deficiencies that became apparent the moment he faced combat. His physical cowardice, evident in his elaborate bunkers far behind the front lines while his troops fought and died, his abusive treatment of subordinates that destroyed unit cohesion, and his complete failure to understand armoured warfare all combined to create the Kasserine disaster. His story demonstrates the importance of realistic training and evaluation that can identify such commanders before they are given responsibility for lives in combat. It also shows the value of ruthless accountability. Once Fredendall's failures became apparent, he was quickly relieved, preventing further disasters. The American military's willingness to admit mistakes and replace failed commanders was a significant advantage over more rigid military systems. Dmitri Pavlov's tragedy was to operate in a system deliberately designed to prevent competent military leadership. The Soviet military under Stalin valued political loyalty over professional competence, punished honest reporting, and executed officers who showed initiative or questioned orders from above. Pavlov's own flawed conclusions about armoured warfare, derived from misinterpreting the Spanish Civil War, were adopted as official doctrine partly because they aligned with Stalin's preferences, and partly because no one dared challenge them forcefully. When disaster struck, Pavlov could not organize an effective defense because doing so would have required disobeying orders, acknowledging the scale of the catastrophe, and showing initiative, all of which could result in execution. His story shows how totalitarian systems inevitably produce military incompetence by creating incentives that reward conformity and punish the qualities needed for successful command: initiative, honesty, adaptability, and willingness to challenge superiors when necessary. His execution served Stalin's political purposes, but did nothing to address the systemic problems that had made the disaster possible. Douglas MacArthur stands apart from the other four commanders because his failures were not the result of limited ability or systemic constraints, but rather of character flaws that occasionally overcame his genuine military talents. He was undeniably brilliant in many ways, a skilled staff officer, an innovative thinker about military organization, and capable of inspired leadership at certain moments. However, his arrogance, his inability to acknowledge mistakes or accept criticism, and his tendency to believe his own propaganda led him to reject sound defensive plans, make wildly optimistic assessments, and fail to prepare adequately for realistic threats. His story teaches that even talented commanders can fail catastrophically if their egos prevent them from confronting uncomfortable realities. It also demonstrates the danger of allowing generals to cultivate personality cults and control their own public images. MacArthur's skillful manipulation of media and public opinion created a hero image that bore little relationship to his actual performance, making it difficult for superiors to hold him accountable for his failures. Beyond their individual failures, these five generals collectively illustrate broader truths about warfare and military organizations. First, preparation matters enormously. Gamelin, Percival, and MacArthur all had time to prepare for the attacks they faced, yet all failed to do so adequately. Whether through rigidity, deference to civilian authority, or arrogance, they squandered opportunities to build proper defenses, position forces effectively, and develop realistic plans. When war came, their lack of preparation turned manageable challenges into catastrophes. Second, leadership is fundamentally about people. Graziani's inability to inspire his troops, Fredendall's abusive treatment of subordinates, and Pavlov's operation in a system that terrorized officers all contributed directly to military failure. Troops will fight desperately for commanders they trust and respect, but they will surrender or flee when led by commanders they despise or fear. The quality of command relationships, from the highest general to the lowest private, determines military effectiveness as much as weapons or numbers. Third, honesty is essential for military success. All 5 of our commanders, in different ways, failed to confront reality honestly. Gamelin convinced himself that the Ardennes was impassable despite evidence to the contrary. Graziani blamed everyone but himself for his failures. Percival underestimated Japanese capabilities and overestimated his own defenses. Fredendall refused to acknowledge his own cowardice and incompetence, instead blaming subordinates. Pavlov operated in a system where honest reporting could be fatal. MacArthur's false promises about Philippine defense and his dishonest communiques created illusions that prevented realistic planning. In each case, the commander's failure to confront uncomfortable truths contributed directly to disaster. Military organizations must create cultures where honest assessment is rewarded, where bad news can be delivered without fear of punishment, and where self-delusion is recognized and corrected before it leads to catastrophe. Fourth, context matters but does not excuse failure. Each of our commanders operated under significant constraints. Gamelin faced a German military that had learned from World War I and developed revolutionary new tactics. Graziani commanded Italian forces hampered by inferior equipment and inadequate logistics. Percival inherited a strategic situation where Singapore's defences were already compromised. Fredendall faced veteran German troops while commanding inexperienced American forces. Pavlov operated under Stalin's terror while facing the most powerful military invasion in history. MacArthur defended an indefensible archipelago with inadequate forces. These contextual factors are real and must be considered in any fair evaluation. However, they cannot excuse the specific decisions these commanders made that worsened their situations. Better leadership might not have guaranteed victory, but it would certainly have improved outcomes and reduced unnecessary casualties. Fifth, the consequences of military failure extend far beyond the battlefield. The fall of France reordered European politics for generations. The North African disasters damaged Italian prestige and necessitated German intervention. The loss of Singapore accelerated the end of European colonialism in Asia. The Kasserine defeat forced fundamental changes in American military culture. The Western Front disaster nearly destroyed the Soviet Union. The Philippine defeat resulted in years of suffering for prisoners and shaped American strategy in the Pacific. Each commander's failure created ripples that extended through time, affecting politics, society, and international relations long after the guns fell silent. This broader impact magnifies the importance of competent military leadership and the tragedy of incompetent command. The comparison between our worst generals and their more successful contemporaries is instructive. While Gamelin was failing to adapt to modern warfare, Charles de Gaulle was writing about the revolutionary potential of armoured forces. While Graziani was surrendering in North Africa, Erwin Rommel was demonstrating how skillful leadership could achieve remarkable results with limited resources. While Percival was surrendering Singapore, William Slim was developing the tactics that would eventually defeat Japanese forces in Burma. While Fredendall was hiding in his bunker, George Patton was leading from the front and inspiring his troops to greatness. While Pavlov was being executed for incompetence, Georgy Zhukov was beginning the career that would make him one of history's great commanders. While MacArthur was failing in the Philippines, Chester Nimitz was beginning the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific. These contrasts show that the failures we have examined were not inevitable products of their times, but rather individual failures that better commanders might have avoided. What makes a good general is a question that has occupied military theorists for centuries. Different eras and different types of warfare require different qualities. However, examining our 5 failures suggests some universal requirements. A good general must be able to adapt to changing circumstances rather than rigidly following doctrine or previous experience. He must understand the capabilities and limitations of his own forces while accurately assessing enemy strengths and weaknesses. He must be able to make difficult decisions under pressure and accept responsibility for the consequences. He must inspire confidence in his subordinates while maintaining realistic communication with superiors. He must combine boldness with prudence, knowing when to take risks and when to consolidate. He must put the welfare of his troops and the success of his mission above personal ambition or glory. And he must be intellectually honest, willing to confront uncomfortable truths and adjust his plans accordingly. None of our 5 commanders possessed all these qualities. Gamelin was too rigid, too wedded to previous experience, and too slow to adapt. Graziani lacked boldness, blamed others for his failures, and crumbled when facing serious opposition. Percival was too deferential to civilian authority and too quick to surrender. Fredendall was physically cowardly, abusive to subordinates, and more concerned with his own safety than his mission. Pavlov misinterpreted his combat experience, operated in a system that prevented honest leadership, and paid with his life for failures that were partly systemic. MacArthur was too arrogant, too focused on his own image, and too dismissive of realistic assessments. Each commander's specific failings created the conditions for disaster when combined with the pressures and uncertainties of war. The question of how military organizations can avoid promoting such commanders to high command is crucial but difficult. Traditional methods of evaluation, such as performance in peacetime exercises, academic achievement, or success in previous wars, all proved inadequate in identifying our 5 failures. Gamelin had been an excellent staff officer in World War I. Graziani had achieved success in colonial campaigns. Percival had fought bravely in World War I and received decorations for courage. Fredendall had impressed superiors with his training performance. Pavlov had combat experience in Spain and had risen through the ranks. MacArthur had graduated first in his class at West Point and achieved significant success in World War I. All seemed like reasonable choices for high command based on their records, yet all failed catastrophically when tested in World War II. Perhaps the answer lies in creating more realistic testing conditions that can expose weaknesses before commanders are given responsibility for actual operations. War games and exercises that involve genuine uncertainty require adaptation to unexpected situations and include realistic consequences for failure, might identify commanders who cannot handle the stress and ambiguity of real combat. Greater emphasis on character evaluation, including assessment of intellectual honesty, humility, and ability to learn from mistakes, might reveal personality flaws that predict failure under pressure. More importantly, military organizations must be willing to relieve commanders quickly when they demonstrate incompetence in combat, as the American military did with Fredendall. Protecting failed commanders out of institutional loyalty or political considerations, as the French did with Gamelin for too long, and as MacArthur's political connections allowed him to do, only magnifies disasters and costs more lives. The human cost of these failures deserves final emphasis. Behind every statistic of surrender, casualties, or lost territory are individual soldiers who paid with their lives, their health, or their freedom for their commanders' mistakes. The French soldiers who died at Sedan, believing they were defending prepared positions when in reality they had been left vulnerable by their commanders' miscalculations. The Italian troops who surrendered in the desert, inadequately trained and poorly led, their courage and determination wasted by incompetent command. The defenders of Singapore, British, Indian, and Australian soldiers who endured years of brutal captivity because their commander surrendered prematurely. The American forces at Kasserine Pass, experiencing their first major battle and being routed because their commander hid in a bunker instead of leading them. The Soviet soldiers trapped at Minsk, surrounded and destroyed because their commander had advocated for the wrong doctrine and failed to prepare adequate defenses. The American and Filipino defenders of Bataan, who starved and died of disease because their commander had rejected sound defensive plans and failed to prepare adequate supplies. These soldiers deserved better. They deserved commanders who would use their lives wisely, who would prepare adequate defenses, who would position forces effectively, who would fight with determination when fighting made sense, and withdraw skillfully when withdrawal was necessary. Instead, they got commanders who failed them through rigidity, cowardice, arrogance, or incompetence. Their suffering and sacrifice stand as an indictment of failed leadership and a reminder of the awesome responsibility that comes with command. When we evaluate military commanders, we must remember that every decision they make has life and death consequences for real human beings who trusted them to lead competently. The 5 generals we have examined fail this fundamental test of command, and history rightly remembers them not for their excuses or their later achievements, but for the disasters they created and the soldiers who paid the price for their failures. As we conclude our examination of World War II's worst generals, we must acknowledge that judging historical figures is always complex and often controversial. Some will defend these commanders, arguing that we have been too harsh or that circumstances beyond their control determined outcomes. Others will argue that we have not been harsh enough, that these failures were even worse than we have portrayed them. Historical judgment is never final, and new evidence or new perspectives may alter our understanding of these events. However, based on the evidence available and the standards by which military commanders must be judged, the conclusion seems clear. These 5 generals, through various combinations of incompetence, poor judgment, character flaws, and systemic failures, presided over some of World War II's most catastrophic defeats. Their legacies serve as cautionary tales about the consequences of failed leadership and the importance of selecting, training, and holding accountable those who command in war. The contrast between these worst generals and the war's best commanders reminds us that leadership truly matters. Wars are not fought by statistics or equipment alone, but by human beings organized, led, and inspired by commanders at all levels. When those commanders are competent, adaptable, courageous, and honest, even disadvantaged forces can achieve remarkable results. When those commanders are incompetent, rigid, cowardly, or dishonest, even superior forces can suffer catastrophic defeats. The 5 generals we have examined failed the fundamental tests of command, and their failures cost nations their security, armies their effectiveness, and individual soldiers their lives and freedom. The question of whether these failures could have been prevented haunts military history. What if France had promoted younger, more innovative officers like Charles de Gaulle instead of Maurice Gamelin? What if Italy had recognized Rodolfo Graziani's limitations and chosen a commander with genuine offensive spirit for the North African campaign? What if Britain had replaced Arthur Percival when his inadequacies became apparent, giving Singapore a commander capable of ruthless preparation and determined defense? What if Lloyd Fredendall had been properly evaluated under realistic conditions that would have revealed his unsuitability for combat command? What if the Soviet Union had not executed its most competent officers in the purges and had properly evaluated Dmitri Pavlov's flawed interpretations of armoured warfare? What if Douglas MacArthur had been willing to accept realistic assessments of Philippine defensibility and had properly implemented proven defensive strategies? These counterfactual questions can never be answered, but they remind us that human decisions and leadership selection processes have enormous consequences. Better choices might have prevented or mitigated these disasters, saving countless lives and altering the course of history. Modern military organizations have attempted to learn from these historical failures and implement systems to prevent similar disasters. Most major militaries now emphasize realistic training that attempts to replicate the stress and uncertainty of actual combat. War games and exercises have become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating genuine uncertainty and requiring commanders to make decisions with incomplete information. Leadership evaluation increasingly focuses on character traits like integrity, adaptability, and ability. To handle stress, not just technical competence or academic achievement, systems for rapidly relieving incompetent commanders have been developed to prevent situations where failed leaders continue to make decisions that cost lives. The principle of mission command, which emphasizes giving subordinates clear objectives while allowing them flexibility in execution, helps prevent the kind of rigid, top-down control that contributed to Gamelin's failure. However, despite these improvements, military organizations still struggle with the fundamental challenge of identifying which officers will succeed under the extreme pressures of combat. Peacetime evaluation can only approximate wartime conditions. Political considerations still sometimes override merit in promotion decisions. Organizations still sometimes protect failed commanders out of institutional loyalty or concern for morale. The qualities that make someone effective in peacetime, such as ability to navigate bureaucracy or impress senior officers, may differ from those needed in combat. As long as these tensions exist, the risk remains that military organizations will promote commanders who will fail when tested by war. The 5 generals we have examined stand as eternal warnings of what can happen when selection, training, or accountability systems fail to work as intended. The psychological dimension of command failure deserves special attention. Military command in major war involves pressures that few human beings can fully prepare for. Commanders must make life and death decisions with incomplete information, under tremendous time pressure, while aware that thousands or even millions of people depend on their judgment. They must maintain confidence and project calm while facing situations that would terrify any normal person. They must balance competing demands from political leaders, logistical realities, enemy actions, and their own troops' capabilities. They must accept responsibility for outcomes while recognizing that many factors lie beyond their control. Some people simply cannot handle these pressures, regardless of their peacetime competence or training. Percival seems to have been overwhelmed by the responsibility, freezing at critical moments. Fredendall appears to have sought refuge in physical distance from the fighting and psychological denial of his situation. Pavlov operated in a system designed to prevent effective command, trapped between the reality of German attack and Stalin's insistence that no such attack was coming. The question of moral responsibility adds another layer of complexity to our evaluation. Are commanders morally culpable for the suffering caused by their incompetence? If so, to what degree? Maurice Gamelin did not intend to cause France's defeat, but his rigidity and poor judgment directly contributed to it. Does good intent excuse catastrophic failure? Rodolfo Graziani's timidity turned potential victory into humiliating defeat. But he was also operating under a fascist system that had promoted him based on brutality rather than military competence. Arthur Percival inherited a situation that had been compromised before he took command, but he failed to take available steps that might have improved Singapore's defences. Lloyd Fredendall was clearly responsible for the Kasserine disaster, but American military culture had promoted him based on peacetime performance without adequately testing his fitness for combat command. Dmitri Pavlov operated in a totalitarian system that made honest assessment and competent leadership nearly impossible, yet he also advocated for the flawed doctrine that contributed to Soviet unpreparedness. Douglas MacArthur's arrogance and poor judgment contributed directly to the Philippine disaster, yet he also achieved significant success in other campaigns. The allocation of moral responsibility in these cases is not straightforward. Yet the human cost of these failures demands some form of accountability. Different nations and military cultures have approached the question of accountability differently. The Soviet Union executed Pavlov and several subordinates, a brutal but clear assignment of responsibility that also served Stalin's political purposes by deflecting blame from his own disastrous leadership. The French arrested Gamelin and attempted to try him for his failures, though the trial was abandoned when it began to expose the complicity of Vichy collaborators. The British did not court-martial Percival, recognizing that he had been placed in an impossible situation, though his reputation was forever tarnished. The Americans removed Fredendall from command but promoted him to avoid public embarrassment, a compromise that satisfied political considerations while ending his combat career. MacArthur faced no accountability for his Philippine failures and went on to become a national hero, his public relations skills allowing him to control the narrative. These different responses reflect different military cultures and political systems, but also highlight the difficulty of appropriately addressing command failure. Too harsh accountability can create fear that inhibits necessary risk-taking. Too lenient treatment can fail to deter future incompetence and deny justice to those who suffered under failed leadership. The impact of these failures on post-war military thinking has been substantial and lasting. The fall of France led to extensive studies of mobile warfare and the importance of combined arms coordination, influencing military doctrine worldwide. The North African campaigns demonstrated the critical importance of logistics and the danger of underestimating opponents. The loss of Singapore highlighted the vulnerability of supposedly impregnable fortifications and the necessity of realistic defensive planning. The Kasserine disaster forced the American military to develop better systems for identifying and removing incompetent commanders, contributing to improved effectiveness throughout the war. The Western Front catastrophe influenced Soviet military reform and doctrine, though Stalin's purges continued to hamper military effectiveness. The Philippine defeat shaped American thinking about island defense and the limitations of dispersed defensive strategies. Each failure became a case study in military education, taught at staff colleges and war colleges around the world. In this sense, these catastrophic defeats have had some positive legacy by providing lessons that have helped prevent similar disasters. The families of these commanders also bore burdens that extended beyond the generals themselves. Gamelin's family lived with the shame of association with France's greatest defeat. Graziani's descendants have struggled with his legacy as both a military failure and a war criminal. Percival's family had to contend with his reputation as the general who surrendered Singapore. Fredendall's relatives have seen his name become synonymous with incompetent command in American military history. Pavlov's family lived for years under the stigma of his execution as a traitor before his posthumous rehabilitation. MacArthur's son had to grow up in the shadow of a controversial and larger-than-life father whose legacy remains contested. The impact of military failure thus extends across generations, affecting not just the commanders and their troops, but families and communities connected to these events. This extended impact underscores the far-reaching consequences of military leadership and the importance of getting selection and preparation right. The technological and tactical evolution of warfare since World War II has changed many aspects of military command, but the fundamental qualities required for successful leadership remain remarkably consistent. Modern commanders still must balance competing demands, make decisions with incomplete information, adapt to unexpected situations, and inspire confidence in subordinates. They still face the temptation to believe their own propaganda, to blame subordinates for their own failures, to hide behind rigid doctrine rather than adapting to reality. The specific tactical and technical knowledge required has changed dramatically, with modern commanders needing to understand cyber warfare, precision-guided munitions, satellite reconnaissance, and a host of other technologies that did not exist in World War II. However, the character traits that distinguish the war's best commanders from its worst, such as integrity, adaptability, physical and moral courage, intellectual honesty, and concern for troops' welfare, remain as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. In our era of professional volunteer militaries and advanced military technology, the risk of catastrophic command failure may seem less immediate than in World War II. However, the fundamental challenges remain. How do military organizations identify which officers will succeed under extreme pressure? How do they balance competing criteria in promotion decisions? How do they create realistic training that approximates combat stress? How do they maintain accountability while avoiding the kind of fear-driven conformity that characterized the Soviet system? How do they ensure that commanders remain intellectually honest and adaptable rather than becoming prisoners of doctrine or their own egos? These questions have no easy answers, and the risk remains that modern military forces will promote commanders who will fail when tested by war. The 5 generals we have examined serve as permanent reminders of what can go wrong and why getting leadership selection right matters so profoundly. The comparison between these worst generals and the many competent, even brilliant commanders of World War II also offers hope. For every Gamelin, there were officers like Heinz Guderian and George Patton, who understood and exploited the revolutionary potential of mobile warfare. For every Graziani, there were commanders like Erwin Rommel and Bernard Montgomery, who achieved remarkable results through skillful leadership and tactical innovation. For every Percival, there were generals like William Slim and Joseph Stilwell, who adapted to jungle warfare and eventually defeated Japanese forces through determination and innovation. For every Fredendall, there were commanders like Omar Bradley and Lucian Truscott, who learned from early mistakes and became highly effective combat leaders. For every Pavlov, there were Soviet generals like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky, who survived the purges and went on to lead the Red Army to victory. And despite MacArthur's failures, there were American commanders like Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance, who executed brilliant strategies in the Pacific. These successful commanders demonstrate that competent leadership is possible, that the challenges of command can be met, and that military organizations can develop systems that promote the right people to high command. The enduring fascination with these failed generals reflects broader human interest in how and why people fail under pressure. Military command failure is dramatic and consequential, affecting the lives of millions and altering the course of history. However, it also illuminates universal human weaknesses. The tendency toward rigidity in thinking, the difficulty of acknowledging our own limitations, the temptation to blame others for our failures, the paralysis that can result from overwhelming responsibility, the way fear can override judgment. These are not just military failures, but human failures that manifest in many contexts. By studying these generals, we learn not just about military history, but about human psychology, about how good people can make catastrophically bad decisions, about how systems can enable or prevent failure, and about the importance of humility, adaptability, and intellectual honesty in any field that involves high-stakes decision-making under pressure. In studying these failures, we honor not the generals themselves, but the soldiers who served under them, who fought despite inadequate leadership, who showed courage in the face of disasters not of their making, and who paid the ultimate price for commanders who were unworthy of them. We also extract lessons that remain relevant for modern military organizations: the importance of honest assessments, the danger of promoting based on peacetime performance alone, the necessity of adaptability in warfare, the value of ruthless accountability for failure, and, above all, the profound responsibility that comes with command. These lessons, purchased at such terrible cost by the soldiers of World War II, deserve to be remembered and applied to prevent similar disasters in the future. That brings us to the end of our examination of the 5 worst generals of World War II. From Maurice Gamelin's rigid defense that led to France's catastrophic collapse, to Rodolfo Graziani's timid leadership that turned overwhelming advantages into humiliating defeat, from Arthur Percival's indecisive command that resulted in Singapore's fall, to Lloyd Fredendall's cowardice that created the Kasserine disaster, and finally to Dmitri Pavlov's fatal miscalculations that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union and cost him his life. These commanders stand as examples of how catastrophically wrong military leadership can go. Their failures shaped the course of World War II, affected millions of lives, and continue to offer lessons for military organizations today. While we remember and celebrate the war's great commanders, we must also study its worst generals, if only to honor those who suffered under their command and to learn the lessons that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. If you enjoyed learning about these catastrophic military failures, make sure to check out our video, What Happened to the Children, of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we explore the fascinating and often tragic stories of those who grew up in the shadow of the Third Reich's most notorious figures. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. We cover everything from military history to the personal stories of those who lived through this defining conflict. Your support helps us continue bringing you detailed, well-researched content about one of history's most important periods. See you in the next one.